It was a typical evening at the library where I spent time leafing through books in search of new ideas for a project. Everything around me looked familiar until she appeared. Her dark hair fell softly over her shoulders, emphasizing her natural beauty, and her brown eyes looked at the shelves with a slight hint of thoughtfulness. She seemed mysterious and ordinary at the same time, but something about her immediately caught my attention. I stood aside, watching her carefully pick up the books as if they were precious treasures. My blue eyes met hers, and that moment was like lightning piercing the space between us. I decided to approach her, although I didn't know what to say. She seemed so focused that I was afraid to disturb her thoughts. "That's a good choice," I said, noticing the title of the book in her hands. She looked up at me, her brown eyes radiating warmth and a slight interest. "Thank you. Are you also interested in philosophy?" she asked, her voice calm but deep. Her dark hair swayed slightly as she bent down to put another book in its place. That simple conversation was the beginning of something bigger, although at the time I didn't know how much my life would change. We spent a few more minutes talking, and I unexpectedly suggested that we go for a walk. She agreed, and together we went out into the cool evening air. The city streets were quiet, and the streetlights cast a warm glow on the wet sidewalk. Her dark hair reflected the light, and her brown eyes looked around with a slight surprise. "I love walking in places like this," she said, and I noticed how her voice echoed in the cold air. We continued walking, not noticing the time, and I realized that this was one of the most enjoyable moments of my life. The next day I saw her again in the park. She was sitting on a bench, holding a notebook and a pen, lost in thought. Her dark hair was tied in a messy bun, and her brown eyes were looking up at the sky as if searching for answers. I decided not to interrupt, but she noticed me and smiled. "Coincidences are not random," she said before I could answer. We spoke again, and I realized that these meetings could not be mere coincidences. We started seeing each other more often, sometimes by chance, sometimes on purpose. Each time I discovered more about her. She loved nature and always found time to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. Her brown eyes would sparkle when she talked about her favorite books or places she dreamed of visiting. Her dark hair would reflect the sunlight as we sat on the grass by the lake, discussing life. I felt that something more was emerging between us than just acquaintance, but I was afraid to take the first step. One evening we decided to stay longer in the park. Darkness was gradually enveloping the earth, and we found a place on a hill with a magnificent view of the starry sky. She was sitting nearby, holding a warm drink in her hands. Her brown eyes watched the heavens with curiosity, and her dark hair fell to her shoulders, slightly developing in the wind. "Every star has its own story," she said quietly, as if talking to herself. I listened to her, captivated by this momentary silence and the beauty of her reflections. "It seems to me that we ourselves are like stars," she added, looking at me. At that moment, I understood how deep her soul was. We started talking about how we could create something special together. Her love of art and my fascination with technology merged into one idea. She wanted to create an installation that would combine traditional painting with interactive elements. Her brown eyes lit up as she explained how she saw the project. "I want people to be able to interact with the art, not just look at it," she said, gesturing enthusiastically. Her dark hair was tied in a neat bun, emphasizing her concentration. I listened attentively, while suggesting technical solutions that could bring her ideas to life. This became our first joint project, and I could feel the trust growing between us. Our project began with enthusiasm, but the first few days showed that it would not be easy to implement. Her ideas were ambitious, and my technique took longer than I had anticipated. "I think this is beyond my capabilities," she said one day, looking at an unfinished sketch. Her brown eyes looked tired, and her dark hair was out of its bun, showing the tension inside her. I put my hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "We can do it. It just takes a little more time." She looked at me, and I saw the confidence in her eyes return. Together, we decided to continue, despite the challenges. To regain our strength, we decided to take a break and went to the botanical garden. She stood among the flowering trees, and I saw her brown eyes fill with new inspiration. "Nature always has the answers," she said, carefully touching the flowers. Her dark hair shone in the sun as she turned to me with a smile. We sat on a bench by the fountain, and she began to talk about the new ideas that had come to her mind. Her voice was full of energy, and I understood that this walk had brought new momentum to both of us. Back in the studio, we set to work with renewed vigor. She began to draw large sketches, and I noticed her brown eyes light up with confidence again. "I think we have everything we need now," she said, looking intently at her drawings. Her dark hair was tied back, but a few strands fell over her face, adding to her natural charm. I adjusted the equipment, watching her fully surrender to the creative process. It was a moment when we both realized that we were moving towards a common goal that could change our lives. After several days of intense work, we were faced with a new challenge. Her idea, while brilliant, required a completely different approach that we had not yet discussed. She sat in the corner of the studio, her brown eyes filled with anxiety. On the table in front of her were dozens of sketches that seemed incomplete. "I think I've lost track," she said quietly, looking at her hands. Her dark hair was pulled back into a low bun, but a few strands were sticking out, as if reflecting her inner chaos. I sat down next to her, carefully arranging her work. "Maybe this is a moment to review. We need to look at everything from a different angle," I said. She looked at me, and I saw a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. We decided to put aside our previous plan and explore new approaches together, knowing that only working together could lead us out of this impasse. Inspiration came when we least expected it. We were sitting in a small cafe, watching people hurry through the streets. Her brown eyes suddenly lit up when she noticed a ray of sunlight breaking through the glass and illuminating the patterns on the table. "Do you see this? Light and shadow create something new. Alive," she said, gesturing with her hand at the play of shades. Her dark hair fell softly to her shoulders, framing her face, which now radiated enthusiasm. I listened to her, watching her write down ideas in a notebook. "This could be the basis of our project. Changing light like a reflection of emotions," she explained. I felt this simple idea fill her with new strength. Back in the studio, her work took on a new lease of life. She painted quickly with inspiration, creating shapes that changed depending on the lighting. Her brown eyes were focused, each stroke seemed thoughtful down to the smallest detail. Her dark hair was pulled back into a high ponytail, but sometimes strands fell across her face, and she quickly brushed them back. "It almost looks like a living organism," I said, watching her work come to life on the canvas. She paused, smiled, and said, "Now it's more than art. It's a story that tells a story about each of us." Her words were filled with passion, and I could see her putting not only technique, but also a piece of her soul into the project. The project was starting to take up more resources and time than we had planned. Her brown eyes looked strained as she tried to figure out how to incorporate all her ideas without losing focus. "This is too much. I'm afraid we won't make it," she said, looking at her calendar. Her dark hair was loose and she was nervously twirling it, trying to find a solution. I walked over to her, putting my hand on her shoulder. "We're halfway there. We can do it. We just need to focus on the main thing," I said. Her gaze softened and she replied quietly, "Thank you. I know you can do it." When the project was finally complete, I could see the pride in her brown eyes. Her work, which combined light, shadow, and emotion, became a true work of art. Her dark hair was tied back, but loose strands fell as she walked around the canvases, inspecting every detail. "This is what I wanted," she said, touching one of the paintings. I stood next to her and felt a surge of pride for her. "You did it," I said, and she looked at me, her eyes full of gratitude. We knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter in her career. The day of the presentation arrived sooner than we expected. The gallery was packed with artists, critics, and just plain curious visitors. She stood at the entrance, nervously scanning the crowd. Her brown eyes radiated both anxiety and excitement, and her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek bun, emphasizing her elegance. "This is the moment of truth," she said softly, barely touching my wrist. Her fingers were cool, but I felt strength and determination in her touch. I leaned closer and said, "They're going to be amazed. You've created something incredible." She took a deep breath and stepped forward, welcoming the first guests. The gallery was filled with her paintings, each one telling a story, full of light and shadow. People stopped at each work, discussing the details with rapt attention. Her voice, as she explained her concept, sounded confident, and I knew this was her moment of triumph. As the evening wore on, the number of guests grew. Her work was the subject of lively discussion, but one moment in particular stood out. A prominent art critic I had noticed earlier in the crowd approached her. His stern gaze seemed to soften as he paused at one of her paintings. "This is truly innovative," he said, meeting her gaze. Her brown eyes widened in surprise, her dark hair glistening softly in the lamplight. "Thank you. It means a lot to me," she replied, barely containing her emotions. His praise was meaningful, and I could see her confidence growing. This moment, though brief, was proof that her work had not been in vain. After the exhibition ended, we were alone in the gallery. She sat on a bench in the center of the room, looking at her work. Her brown eyes were filled with gratitude, but also a hint of fatigue. "It was harder than I thought," she admitted, smiling. Her dark hair was slightly out of its bun, emphasizing her natural beauty after such a busy day. I sat down next to her and handed her a glass of water. "But you did it," I said, watching her gaze warm. She looked back at her paintings and added, "This is just the beginning. I feel like I can create something even bigger." The next morning, she received a letter from an international art organization. Her work had been invited to participate in a competition where the best artists from all over the world were competing. Her brown eyes sparkled with excitement as she read the message. "This is incredible, but it will be difficult," she said, worried. Her dark hair was tied in a neat ponytail, and she nervously twisted a pen in her hands. I smiled and said, "You have already proven that you are capable of more. This is your chance to prove yourself again." She took a deep breath and nodded. "Then let's get started. We have a lot of work ahead of us," she added, and I saw the fire in her eyes light up again. We began preparing for the competition with meticulous attention to detail. She worked on a series of new paintings, experimenting with techniques she had never used before. Her brown eyes glowed with passion as she applied bright strokes of her brush. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders, sometimes in the way, but she didn't even notice it, completely immersed in her work. I helped her adjust the lighting and prepare the materials. "It's going to be difficult, but I want to show everything I can," she said, her voice full of confidence. Together we were creating something that would impress even the harshest critics. We knew the competition would require something unique, and she decided to explore her roots. One day we set out for her hometown, where she grew up, surrounded by nature and tranquility. She showed me the old roads, the fields, and we stopped by her childhood home. "This is where I first realized I wanted to be an artist," she said, her brown eyes filled with warm memories. Her dark hair was pulled back into a light braid, and a smile lit up her face. She talked about how every corner of this place had influenced her imagination. "I want this to be the basis for my work," she added, looking at me. I felt like this moment was a real reset for her creativity. Back in the studio, she immediately got to work. Her brown eyes were ablaze with ideas, and her hands were quickly working on new sketches. Scenes from her childhood began to appear on her canvases: an old house, a road between trees, a sunset over fields. "This is what I was looking for," she said, stepping back a step to look at her work. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy bun, but the strands stood out, emphasizing her concentration. I helped her with the materials, and together we discussed how best to convey the atmosphere of these places. Her creativity came to life again, and it was noticeable in every detail of her work. However, inspiration took a lot of effort. After several days of non-stop work, she looked exhausted. Her brown eyes were a little blurry, and her dark hair had flowed down her shoulders. "I think I'm losing my rhythm," she said, sitting on the studio floor among her numerous sketches. I walked over to her, sat down next to her, and handed her a cup of tea. "Sometimes you have to stop and see the big picture," I said, looking at her. She looked at me and smiled. "You're right. It's probably time to rest a bit," she replied, slowly sipping her tea. We decided to take a break and just talk to regain our strength. The next day, to find a new source of inspiration, we went to a live music concert. Her brown eyes lit up with every note, her dark hair shimmering in the stage light. "It's incredible. The music feels like it's touching your soul," she said, her arms folded across her chest. After the concert, she immediately began jotting down ideas in her notebook, not wanting to miss a single thought. "We can convey these emotions through paint," she added, her voice filled with enthusiasm. I felt the experience revitalize her, bringing back the inspiration she had seemed to have lost. Returning to her studio after the concert, she began painting with renewed vigor. Her work now radiated not only visual beauty, but also a melody that seemed alive. Her brown eyes sparkled as she gazed at the finished painting, each brushstroke like a musical note. "It was hard, but now I know this is exactly what I needed," she said, stepping back a few steps to assess her work. Her dark hair was pulled back into a bun, but a few strands fell across her face. I stepped closer and said, "This is your masterpiece. They will see it." She looked at me, her eyes filled with gratitude. The following weeks were hectic. Her work was almost finished, but each day brought new details she wanted to refine. She spent long hours in front of her canvases, her brown eyes shining with concentration, her dark hair tied back in a ponytail so as not to get in the way. "This has to be perfect," she would repeat, adding the final touches. Her hands were covered in paint and her clothes were stained, but she paid no attention. I helped with the technical settings, trying to create the best lighting to present her paintings. She stopped only when she was sure that her work conveyed exactly what she felt. "This is more than a painting. This is my story," she said, her voice full of emotion. When the works were finished, it was time to prepare them for shipping. She inspected each painting, her brown eyes examining each brushstroke in detail. "I want each painting to be protected, as if it were a part of me," she said, carefully wrapping one of the works in a cloth. Her dark hair was tied back, but a few strands fell over her face, adding to her vulnerable charm. I helped pack the canvases, making sure everything was perfect. We worked in silence, each of us understanding the importance of this moment. When the last painting was finished, she looked at me and said, "Thank you for believing in me even when I doubt myself." We arrived at the exhibition hall, where the atmosphere was tense and expectant. She paused at the entrance, her brown eyes scanning the space. "This is incredible. I never imagined I would be here," she said, her voice soft but filled with awe. Her dark hair was pulled back into a bun, and her black dress emphasized her grace. We arranged her paintings, and I could see her meticulously checking every detail to make sure everything looked perfect. "Now all that's left to do is wait," she said, looking at me. I replied, "You've already won because you've done something incredible." Throughout the day, numerous visitors, including the jury, approached her work. Her brown eyes carefully observed people's reactions. They lingered near the paintings. Some even wrote down their thoughts. One of the critics approached her and said, Your work conveys something deep and personal. This is truly inspiring art. Her dark hair shone in the lamplight, and her smile was modest but sincere. Thank you. I just wanted to tell my story, she replied. This moment was confirmation for her that all her efforts had been worthwhile. At the end of the day, we received news that changed everything. Her work had been selected for a special award for innovation in art. She stood still, her brown eyes shining with tears of joy. I don't even know what to say, she whispered, looking at me. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders as she lowered her head, trying to calm her emotions. I took her hands and said, "You deserve this more than anyone else. This is just the beginning." She smiled through her tears, and that moment was another step toward her dream for both of us. After receiving the award, we were the last to leave the exhibition hall. The evening air was cool but fresh. She walked beside me, holding the award in her hands as if afraid to let it go. Her brown eyes shone with joy, and her dark hair fell softly to her shoulders, fluttering in the light breeze. "I can't believe this happened. It's like a dream," she said, pausing for a moment and looking up at the starry sky. Her voice was soft but confident. I smiled and replied, "This is the result of your work. You deserve it." She looked at me, and there was more than just gratitude in her eyes. We continued walking, enjoying the quiet evening and realizing that even greater achievements awaited us ahead. Despite her success, she was plagued by doubts the next day. "What if it's just luck? What if my work isn't really that good?" she said, sitting on the windowsill of her studio. Her brown eyes looked intense, and her dark hair fell to her shoulders, giving her a vulnerable look. She seemed small and lonely, lost in her thoughts. I walked over to her, sat down opposite her, and said, "Your success is the result of your hard work, talent, and passion. It's not an accident." She sighed and looked at me, her gaze softening a little. "Maybe you're right," she replied, but I knew she needed more support. To overcome her doubts, she decided to take on a new project. This time, she wanted to create something completely different, combining movement, music, and visual art. Her brown eyes were glowing with inspiration, and her dark hair was tied in a neat ponytail, emphasizing her concentration. "I want it to be like a dance in colors, so that the audience can feel the energy through movement and color," she explained, sketching on a large sheet of paper. I sat next to her, writing down her ideas and suggesting technical solutions. She laughed when some of my suggestions seemed too complicated for her. "It's ambitious, but we'll try," she said, and I knew this project would be another step forward. Working on a new project proved more difficult than we thought. She spent hours trying to find the right balance between movement and color. Her brown eyes stared intently at the screen, where her sketches were displayed digitally. "This isn't it. I feel like I'm missing something," she said, tapping the keys with a hint of irritation. Her dark hair was pulled back into a ponytail, but strands of it were sticking out, reflecting her inner struggle. I suggested a break, but she shook her head. "No, I have to finish this today." I stayed by her side, providing technical support and simply watching her struggle with her doubts. After days of hard work, she finally found a solution. Her new painting, brought to life by movement and light, looked as if it were breathing. Her brown eyes shone with joy as she showed off the finished work. "This is what I've been dreaming of. Now it makes sense," she said, looking at the painting. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders, framing a face that radiated pride. I moved closer and gently touched her shoulder. "That's great. Now you see how far you've come?" She smiled and replied, "It's because of you. You've always supported me." In that moment, we both realized that together we could overcome any challenge. When her latest project was finished, we got an unexpected call from a major gallery in New York. She had been invited to participate in an international exhibition dedicated to innovative approaches to art. Her brown eyes were bright with surprise and joy, and her dark hair fell to her shoulders as she listened intently to the offer. "This is incredible. I didn't even think this was possible," she said, hanging up the phone. I saw a mixture of joy and a little fear in her eyes. "This is your chance and you're ready," I said, leaning in to encourage her. She hugged me and added, "I can do it if you're here." Preparing for the trip was hectic but exciting. She spent hours reviewing her work, choosing the ones that best represented her style. Her brown eyes sparkled with concentration as she carefully packed the canvases. "I want them to see not just my art, but a piece of my world," she said to me. Her dark hair was pulled back into a braid, her face radiating confidence. I helped with paperwork, arrangements, and even the logistics of transporting the paintings. "This is not just an exhibition. This is your world premiere," I said, and she nodded, understanding the importance of this moment. The journey to New York was long but full of anticipation. She sat by the window of the plane, her brown eyes staring up at the clouds. "This is my first trip this far," she said, smiling slightly. Her dark hair was tied back in a ponytail, and a light scarf added elegance. When we landed, she looked a little tired but excited. The streets of New York were bustling with activity, and she breathed in the city as if every corner were part of her inspiration. "This is a place where anything seems possible," she said, looking out at the glittering storefronts. I felt that New York was ready to welcome her, as she was to welcome him. The next morning we set off for the gallery that would host her exhibition. The building was impressive, tall windows, a space filled with light. She stood at the entrance, her brown eyes scanning the facade with wonder. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders, and her blouse and jeans gave her the air of a modern traveler. "This place feels like it was made for dreaming," she said, clutching her notebook to her. Inside the gallery, her works were arranged on the walls, and I could see her going through each step of the installation. She touched each painting, as if confirming their readiness for this momentous occasion. When the gallery opened to the public, the excitement was at its peak. Her paintings were a real eye-catcher. Visitors stopped to look at every detail, discussing it among themselves. She stood by one of the paintings, her brown eyes intently watching people's reactions. Her dark hair fell softly, and her black suit gave her an air of sophistication. One of the spectators came up and said, "This is incredible. It feels like there's not just beauty in your paintings, but soul." She thanked me with a small smile, and I could see the excitement building in her self-confidence. "This is just the beginning," she told me quietly. In the crowd of the gallery, an elderly man caught her eye. He stood for a long time in front of one of the paintings, his gaze full of emotion. She moved closer, his brown eyes shining with curiosity. "Your work. It reminded me of when I was young," the man said, turning to her. His words were filled with sincerity, and it touched her. Her dark hair fell softly to her shoulders as she replied, "That's the best compliment I could ever hear." They continued talking, and this stranger shared his admiration for her style. I could see a new confidence in her eyes, inspiring her to keep going. After the exhibition opened, we went out onto the gallery terrace. New York at night seemed endless, the lights of the skyscrapers reflected in her brown eyes, filling them with sparkle. "It was one of the best nights of my life," she said, looking out over the city. Her dark hair fluttered in the night breeze, her coat tightly wrapped around her shoulders. "But I understand that this is only the first step," she added, turning to me. Her voice was confident, but I could hear the excitement in it for what lay ahead. I smiled and replied, "You're ready for any challenge." She smiled back, and that moment became a symbol of her beginning on a new level. The next day, a journalist approached her for an interview. At first, she was nervous, her brown eyes a little anxious as she sat down at the table. "I've never given an interview before," she said, smoothing back her dark hair that fell to her shoulders. I assured her that everything would be fine. The journalist asked questions about her work, her inspirations, and her future plans. Her voice grew more confident, and she spoke with passion as she described her work. When the interview was over, she sighed with relief and thanked the journalist. "It was an interesting experience," she told me later. "I saw her grow and become stronger." After a busy day, we decided to spend the evening in Central Park. She sat on a bench, her brown eyes watching the ducks swimming in the lake. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and a warm sweater gave her a cozy look. "These moments are important," she said, turning to me. "They allow me to find a balance between stress and inspiration." We talked about the future, about how far she had come. Her voice was calm, and I felt that these moments of rest were as important to her creativity as the process itself. After returning from the park, she immediately opened her notebook and began to draw. Her brown eyes were focused, her dark hair falling to her shoulders as she worked on new sketches. I realized that I wanted to create a series of works that would capture moments of harmony in chaos, she said, pausing for a moment to explain her idea. Her voice was full of inspiration, and I could see her hands moving confidently, creating new shapes. "This could be a big project," she added, looking at me. I just nodded, knowing that her ideas always turned into something amazing. A few weeks later, her new project was ready to be displayed. It was a series of works that depicted moments of harmony amidst chaos, conveyed through expressive brushstrokes and bright colors. She stood in the center of the studio, her brown eyes filled with pride and a slight excitement. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders, and her light dress added to her image as an inspired artist. "I think this is the best thing I've created," she said, examining the paintings hanging around her. I agreed, seeing how her works conveyed deep emotions. "These are not just paintings, they are stories that touch everyone," I said, and she looked at me with gratitude. A well-known patron of the arts, who had long been interested in contemporary art, came to the presentation of the new project. He approached each painting, his gaze lingering on the details. Her brown eyes watched his reaction with curiosity, and her dark hair was neatly tied in a bun. "Your works are truly exceptional," he said, turning to her. "They tell something personal and at the same time universal." She smiled gratefully and replied, "That's what I was trying to do, create a connection between the viewer and my feelings." Their conversation lasted a long time, and I could see her confidently explaining her concept. The evening after the presentation brought unexpected news. Her work had not only been admired, but had also been nominated for a prestigious competition. She sat at her desk in the studio, her brown eyes shining with joy as she read an email. Her dark hair was falling over her face, but she didn't even notice. "This is more than I could have imagined," she said, looking at me. Her voice was trembling with emotion, and I knew how important this was to her. "Now it's up to you. Show the world what you're capable of," I replied, and she smiled, ready for new challenges. One evening, while walking in the park, she suddenly stopped. Her brown eyes looked at the starry sky, and her dark hair fluttered in the wind. "You know, this is more than just art for me. It's a way to show myself to the world, to tell about my thoughts and feelings," she said, turning to me. Her voice was full of reflection, and I could see how important this moment was for her. I listened silently, allowing her to express everything that had accumulated in her soul. "I want people to feel that they are not alone," she added, and I realized how sincere her work was. The next morning she woke up full of energy and ideas. Her brown eyes sparkled as she jotted down new concepts in her notebook. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders, and she seemed so focused that she didn't even notice me bring her a cup of coffee. "I think this is going to be my best series yet," she said, flipping through pages filled with sketches. Her voice was confident, and I could see her taking her creativity to the next level. I sat down next to her and replied, "I know it's going to be amazing. You always outdo yourself." She smiled, and that day was the beginning of an exciting new chapter in her life. A few weeks later, she was back at work on a new project for the biggest exhibition of her career. This was her chance to present not just paintings, but an interactive experience that combined contemporary art with technology. Her brown eyes were ablaze with inspiration as she explained her concept. Her dark hair, which she had braided for the first time, gave her the air of an artist taking on great ambitions. "This is going to be something unforgettable," she said as she began to plan each stage of the work. I was there, providing technical solutions for the interactive elements, and I knew she could create something that would exceed all expectations. The ideas she brought to life were incredibly innovative. She assembled a collection of digital elements that changed depending on how the viewer interacted with the paintings. Her brown eyes followed her every step as she developed the concept. Her dark hair was tied back in a high ponytail, and she wore comfortable clothes to feel free while she worked. "I want people to feel like they are part of this art," she said, inspiringly describing how each element would change as people approached the paintings. It was a real challenge, but I could see her immersing herself in every detail with great enthusiasm. The process wasn't smooth sailing. Technical difficulties began to arise when elements didn't interact as we expected. Her brown eyes grew sad with frustration. "It just doesn't work the way it's supposed to," she said, sighing and swiping her finger across the screen. Her dark hair fell across her face as she tried to fix the error. I walked over to her and started going through all the settings with her. "We'll find a solution. It'll work," I said, and we spent a few more hours together, trying out different options. At the end, she smiled. "It was difficult, but now it works." I could see her becoming even more determined, her inspiration returning. After a few weeks of work, when everything finally fell into place, we took a short break. The evening was calm and misty, and we sat in the park, looking at the sky. Her brown eyes watched the moon, and her dark hair fell softly over her shoulders. "Did you ever think that everything would change?" she asked quietly. I looked at her and noticed how serious her face became. "Yes, I think every big moment in life brings change, but those changes are what make us stronger," I replied. She nodded, and we continued to sit in silence, realizing how important this period had become for both of us. A few days before the exhibition, we decided to hold a final rehearsal for the installation. She was excited and a little nervous as she checked each element. Her brown eyes never left the screens where her work was combined with new interactive technologies. Her dark hair was neatly styled, and every movement was clear and confident. "This has to be perfect," she repeated, following each stage of the installation. I was there, helping to set up the technical details and adjust everything so that everything was ready for the exhibition. When we were finished, she stepped back, examining her work. "This is going to be incredible," she said, and I saw in her eyes the confidence she had gained over the months. Finally, the big day arrived, the opening of the exhibition. The entire hall was packed with people, and the atmosphere was filled with tension and excitement. She stood next to her installation, her brown eyes following every move of the visitors. Her dark hair was pulled back into an elegant bun, and she looked flawless in a classic black dress. All eyes were on her work, and I could see her heart beating faster with excitement. "This is amazing. I had no idea so many people would be here," she said, her gaze filled with anxiety. But as time went on, her confidence grew. I walked up to her and said, "You deserve every minute of this attention." She smiled, and together we watched people immerse themselves in her art. Shortly after the exhibition opened, several important critics approached her installation. They paused at each work, carefully examining its elements. Her brown eyes sparkled with excitement as she watched the audience's reactions. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders, and her dress looked as if it were part of her art. "This is very innovative," one of the critics said, approaching her after a long silence. "You've managed to combine art with technology in a way that makes it seem alive." She thanked him, her voice trembling with emotion. I could see how these compliments boosted her confidence and helped her realize that her style and approach to art were finally receiving the recognition she deserved. The evening after the exhibition was quiet, and we went together to the cafe where we usually met. She sat at the table, smiling slightly, but her brown eyes showed the excitement that had not subsided. "I don't even know what I feel. It's like a dream come true," she said, her dark hair loose. I smiled and replied, "You deserve it. Your work speaks for itself." She looked at me in surprise and said, "But this is not the end, is it? I still have so many ideas." I knew that her artistic journey was just beginning. After a busy day, we went out onto the terrace of her apartment to rest for a while. Moonlight reflected off her brown eyes as she looked out over the city at night. I never thought I would come this far. "But now I understand that this is just the first step," she said, her voice calm but determined. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders and her face reflected the calm that comes after great achievements. I sat next to her, knowing that this moment would be important for her future journey. "This is just the beginning. You can achieve even more," I said. Within days, her new project was ready to be submitted to an international competition. She stood in her studio, her brown eyes brimming with enthusiasm, her dark hair flowing down her shoulders, adding an energy to her image. "This is something completely new. I want to show the world that art can be not only for contemplation, but also for interaction," she said, holding her latest sketches in her hands. I looked at her face, which was glowing with passion for what she was doing. "You've already shown what you can do. Now it's your turn to change the world," I replied. She looked at me and smiled, and I knew her career was only gaining momentum. After submitting her work to an international competition, she received an unexpected offer, an exhibition in London. Her brown eyes lit up at the news, her dark hair falling softly as she stood in her studio, contemplating everything that was happening. "London is a real chance to show yourself on the world stage," she said, holding her breath. "I can't believe how fast things are moving," she added, clutching the invitation in her hands. I smiled and replied, "You've done everything to deserve this chance. This is your moment." Together, we began to plan the next step. She was full of determination and energy, ready for a new challenge. A few days passed quickly, and we began to prepare for the trip. Her brown eyes followed every step as she gathered the works for transport. Her dark hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and she looked focused yet inspired. "It's a big step, but I'm ready for it," she said, holding up one of the paintings. I helped with all the necessary paperwork and travel arrangements. "I know you can do it," I replied, watching her find the strength to move forward again. Her every move was filled with confidence, and I could see her talent setting her on a path that would lead to great achievements. The journey to London was long, but exciting. She sat next to me, her brown eyes filled with excitement as we passed through the airport. Her dark hair framed her face, emphasizing the expression of her emotions. "I still can't believe this is happening," she said, looking at me. "I thought it would only be a dream, but now it's a reality." I smiled and replied, "Dreams only become reality when you work for them." She nodded, and together we headed for the plane, ready for new experiences and opportunities. Arriving in London was unforgettable. The city was stunning with its grand streets, ancient architecture, and incredible atmosphere. She looked out the taxi window, her brown eyes captivated by the grandeur of this capital. "London. This is the city that has always been in my dreams," she said, her voice filled with delight. Her dark hair fluttered in the wind, and her smile grew even wider. "Are you ready for this?" I asked. She nodded, and we headed to the gallery, knowing that this would be a significant moment in her career. Our first day in London was spent exploring the city and preparing for the exhibition. She strolled through the gallery, her brown eyes focused as she checked to make sure everything was ready. Her dark hair was neatly styled, and her light dress emphasized elegance and ease. "This place feels so alive," she said, surveying the space. I noticed her gaze growing more confident. "You're going to have a blast here," I replied. She smiled, and together we began to prepare for this momentous event. I knew in that moment that she was ready to conquer any peak. After the exhibition opened, the first reviews began to come in. Her brown eyes sparkled with emotion as she read the positive comments from visitors. "This is incredible. I didn't even expect this kind of recognition," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders, and her stylish suit emphasized her elegance. I could see her heart fill with pride for all she had achieved. "You deserve it," I said, watching her reaction. She smiled, once again confident in herself and her work. It was further confirmation that she was on the right track. A few days later, several prominent art critics approached her. They stood in front of her work, discussing it among themselves, and then turned to her. Her brown eyes were focused as she listened to their thoughts. "Your work is incredibly profound. It's not just art. It's an experience," one of the critics said. Her dark hair was styled in a stylish updo, and her classic outfit emphasized elegance. She thanked them for the compliments, her voice calm but full of pride. "It's been a long journey, but I'm happy that everything is going the way I planned," she said, and I realized that her work had found its place in the world. At the exhibition, she met several other artists with whom she formed a professional relationship. They exchanged ideas, techniques, and plans for the future. Her brown eyes sparkled with enthusiasm as she discussed possibilities for collaboration with them. Her dark hair sparkled with every movement she made, and her stylish suit looked impeccable on her. "We could do something unique together," one of the artists said, and she happily agreed. I watched them, aware of how she was opening up new horizons in art. Her willingness to collaborate and her desire for new ideas amazed me. At the end of the day, after all the interviews and discussions, we went for a walk around London. The city streets were filled with light, and she walked beside me, her brown eyes shining with fatigue and happiness. "It's been a hard journey, but I will never give up on my dreams," she said, pausing to look at the beautiful architecture. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders, her light scarf swaying in the wind. "You've shown the world who you are, and I know this is just the beginning," I replied. She smiled and nodded, once again confident in herself and her abilities. Back home, she felt a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. All of her work had been exhibited internationally, and her heart felt full. Her brown eyes were focused but not strained as she looked at her latest painting, which she had decided to leave at home. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders, and she looked relaxed for the first time in a long time. "I'm home. I know there's still a lot of work to do, but I'm ready for anything now," she said. I sat next to her and replied, "You've already done more than you could ever imagine. Now it's just beginning." She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw the determination and confidence that had become part of her new identity. After returning home, she began to delve into new ideas for her next project. Her brown eyes were full of determination as she looked through the new materials, lost in thought. Her dark hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, and she sat on the floor among sketches and old paintings, searching for inspiration. "I want to create something new that reflects my feelings at this stage," she said, unfolding new sheets of paper and drawings. I sat next to her, watching her delve into her thoughts. Her hands moved across the paper as if magically transforming each idea into a new creation. "You always found ways to convey your emotions through art," I replied. It took several days to decide on the right direction for her new project. She stood before a large canvas, carefully examining the space she was about to fill. Her brown eyes never left what was to become her next masterpiece. "I think I'll work on the theme of inner transformation. It'll be something intimate, deep, but at the same time open to the audience," she said, stepping back a little to assess her thoughts. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her face was calm, thoughtful. I stood by and watched her choose the right path, knowing that her art would be even more personal and expressive. Choosing colors for a new project became another important part of her work. She would linger on each shade, studying how each one could convey the desired emotions. Her brown eyes carefully analyzed each palette, and her dark hair fell to her shoulders as she found the perfect balance of colors. These colors will harmonize with each other and emphasize the contrasts that I want to create, she said, mixing paints on the palette. I watched her process, understanding how important each small step was to achieve the ideal. She was ready for this new challenge, and I knew that this would be another stage in her creative development. After a few days of work, the first sketches of the new project were ready. She placed them in front of her, her brown eyes carefully assessing each brushstroke. "It's not the final version yet, but I can already see where I'm going," she said, examining the results of her labors. Her dark hair was tied back in a bun, and she looked as if she were in her element, in complete concentration. I walked up to her and said, "That's great. You've already found your idea. Now you just need to make it happen." She smiled, her gaze more determined than ever. One day, while working on a new painting, she suddenly stopped and looked at me with a serious expression on her face. "I want to make this not just my art, but also a statement. It will be something that shows my deepest feelings, even if they are difficult to perceive," she said. Her brown eyes were full of determination, and her dark hair fell softly to her shoulders as she decided to change her approach to this project. "This will be my greatest challenge," she added. I smiled and replied, "I believe you can do it, and whatever you want to convey through your work will be clear." She began work on the final part of her series, which was to be a depiction of her inner world. Her brown eyes were intent as she drew over and over again, searching for the right form. Her dark hair was loose, giving her the air of an artist who was not afraid to express her deepest emotions. "I want it to feel like a rebirth, like finding yourself in the midst of chaos," she said, pausing for a moment to assess the result. I sat nearby, watching as each brushstroke revealed her soul. Her heart was open to the world, and this drawing was her statement about herself. But the work on the painting proved difficult. She paused, considering her actions, her brown eyes strained. "I don't know if this is the right path. Should I take a path that might be too difficult for the audience?" she asked, a little confused. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders, and I could see her struggling with doubts. I approached her and said, "This is your work, and you have the right to express it however you feel. This is your path, your story." She thought for a moment and nodded, feeling that this path, although difficult, would be her true path. Night came, and we sat on the balcony of her apartment, watching the moon. She looked calm, but I saw in her eyes the same excitement she felt in the studio. "You're right. I just have to trust myself and my feelings," she said, her brown eyes reflecting the moonlight. Her dark hair fell softly on her shoulders, and this moment of rest was necessary for her soul. I took her hand, and we sat in silence, listening to the night sounds of the city. It was the moment when she found her inner peace again, ready to overcome any difficulties. The next day she returned to the canvas, full of determination. Her brown eyes sparkled as she began to apply new strokes, trying to bring her idea to life. Her dark hair, once again tied in a simple ponytail, emphasized her concentration. "Now I know exactly how I want to finish it," she said, as she began to see the final result. I watched her brush move confidently, and I felt that her work had become more mature, more profound. She had found harmony with herself and her art again. A few days later, she finished her painting. She stood before it, her brown eyes studying each stroke carefully. "That's it. I'm done," she said, her voice filled with satisfaction and peace. Her dark hair was loose, and she looked as if this moment was the culmination of her creation. I walked over to her and looked at the painting. "It's amazing." "You did it," I said, and she looked at me with a smile. Now I can rest easy knowing that I've expressed myself. A few days after completing the painting, she invited her friends and colleagues to a private presentation. Her brown eyes sparkled with excitement as she showed everyone her new creation. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders, and her outfit, a light dress and a stylish jacket, emphasized her elegance. "This is a work that has become a reflection of everything I have experienced," she said, looking at the painting. Every visitor was amazed. Some could not take their eyes off what she had created. She looked at me and said, "I believe this is my best work." I smiled and replied, "I have no doubt." After the presentation, we heard a lot of feedback. Visitors admired her art, and several famous artists even offered to collaborate. Her brown eyes shone with joy and gratitude as she read the first reviews. "This is just incredible. I never imagined that my work would receive such a response," she said, her dark hair loose and her face showing the joy of success. I looked at her with pride and said, "You deserve all this. This is just the beginning." She looked at me with a smile, and I saw her confidence grow even stronger. Thanks to the success of the exhibition, she received several inquiries from galleries wanting to exhibit her work in other cities. Her brown eyes were filled with surprise when she received offers of collaboration from prestigious institutions. "This is a chance I never dreamed of. All these opportunities are the result of my work," she said, looking at me with gratitude. Her dark hair fell to her shoulders as she dreamed of new prospects. I felt she was ready for a new stage in her career. "This is your reward for everything you've done," I replied, and she nodded, realizing that this was just the beginning. She sat on the balcony, looking up at the stars, her brown eyes as focused and deep as the stars themselves. "You know, sometimes I feel like I'm just beginning to understand what art is. All these events, all the possibilities, it's more than I could have imagined," she said, her dark hair loose, and every movement of the wind made her look even more pensive. I sat next to her, listening to her words. "Art is not just paintings. It's your heart, your experiences, your vision of the world," I replied. She smiled and rested her head on my shoulder. The next day, she set off for a new gallery to prepare for a major exhibition in Paris. Her brown eyes were full of confidence as she surveyed her work again. Her dark hair was neatly styled, and she looked even more elegant in a stylish coat. "This is not just an exhibition. This is the next stage, a new step in my artistic life," she said, her voice confident. I helped organize it again, knowing that this trip would be a landmark one. "And it will be your best exhibition, I'm sure," I replied, and she nodded, ready for the next step in her career.